Greetings, one and all. We are back for another edition of Indicator Plants of BC. This time we have group number 2, and group number 2 I decided to call the margins. And why do I call it that? It's because for the most part, these are plants that really like to occupy marginal spaces. So if you're driving along, you'll see these plants kind of by the sides of roads. A lot of these are really alpine species that you'll find in areas that, not a lot of other plants can occupy. And so we've got kind of these, so a lot of these plants really kind of like their poorer soils, and they're really good at, they're quite hardy. All right, and what do we have this week? So, a few different groups. We have our tall pink flowers. We have a couple of heathers. And then we have a few things that don't really look like anything else in this course. And so hopefully these aren't the ones that you're going to find confusing. These are the ones that you're just going to look at them and be like, yeah, I know exactly what that is. And starting with our tall pink flowers, we've got our hardhack and fireweed. First up, hardhack, Spiraea douglasii. So let's look at the scientific name of this one. Douglasii, this is a species name that pops up from time to time. You tend to see this one fairly often, both animals and plants. And why that is because it's named for David Douglas, who's this famous Scottish botanist, came over and kind of, identified taxonomically a whole bunch of different organisms in the New World where we are. Yeah, so you've got, so Spiraea douglasii is named for him. You've also got Douglas fir, which is a tree that you'll talk about a lot more if you continue on with your forestry. All right, so let's look in at some of the features of this one. On the left here, we have our flowers. Now, you'll notice with the flowers of this one, so this isn't a big flower here. This is actually a huge conically shaped cluster of millions and millions and millions of tiny little flowers. Well, not millions, but dozens and dozens of dozens maybe. And if you kind of look around the edges, it's really hard to distinguish between individual flowers. It just kind of looks like this big clump here. And you can see all their little stamens poking out. It gives it a really fuzzy appearance. But yeah, the thing to note about this one is that when you just look at it, the flowers are so small and that it's really hard to distinguish between individual flowers. Yeah, beautiful pink color as well. Alrighty, so if you're getting that confused with any of our other pink flowered plants that we're going to talk about, then the really bomb-proof way that you can identify your hardhack is by looking at the leaves, though. So check out this leaf. Now we're going to look around the edge here, and it's a really identifiable leaf because on the bottom half, it's what we call entire. And that's a botanical word, means that it's just really smooth looking. It doesn't really have any little sinewy bits or bumps or serrations or whatever. So it's got this entire leaf edge or leaf margin on the bottom. But then when you get towards the outer half, it's got this serrated margin here. And so you've got all these little teeth coming out. And this is kind of a unique one because, you'll have a lot of leaves. Leaves tend to be, kind of one thing or another. And so you'll have leaves that tend to be entire the whole way around, or you'll have leaves that tend to be serrated the whole way around. You'll have leaves that tend to be, they might be wavy the whole way around. But this one, it changes halfway through. So you look for the leaves that are serrated on the end and entire on the bottom. Then you also look for those fuzzy looking clusters of flowers there. All right, just another look at the underside of the leaf. So I took this photo in Pacific Spirit Park, and this is just to give you a sense of how big it is. Yeah, so that's my hand there, and you can see the whole thing is probably a little bit longer than my thumb. Alrighty, moving on to our fireweed, Epilobium angustifolium. So our fireweed, this is kind of a funny one because you look at the soil moisture, you look at the soil nutrients, it has a super wide range for both. And we talked about, in the very first video that indicator plants are useful because they have really narrow ranges of these things. So what does fireweed indicate? Fireweed is a really good indicator of recent disturbance. So yeah, this is a good indicator of areas that have been that have recently been opened up. Maybe there was an overstory before of trees, and then those were cut down, and then the fireweed comes in really quickly. It's a really good cereal kind of pioneer species. Alrighty, and looking at the scientific name of this one as well, angustifolium. So angustifolium is a name that we have got a couple angustifoliums in the course actually. If you pay attention to these names, you'll notice things start to repeat themselves after a little while. And basically what this means, this comes from Latin and it means narrow-leaved. So that gives you a little clue about what to look for with this plant. It's got kind of these narrow-looking leaves that we'll have a closer look at in a moment. But first of all, let us take a look at the flowers. Now, think about the flowers of the hardhack that you just looked at. They were all in this big fuzzy cluster. There were lots and lots and lots of them, and you couldn't really distinguish between individual flowers. Now compare that with the fireweed that you're looking at now. Fireweed has these flowers that, they're about the size of a quarter, or maybe if you're in Canada, maybe a loonie. And so they're quite a bit bigger, and you can distinguish between, you can tell what an individual flower is from a distance. Also, the hardhack flowers were completely pink. Our fireweed flowers, you'll notice that they've got kind of these white-looking stamens in the middle there, these little reproductive parts. So that is another way, that's one way to distinguish them. And looking at the leaves now, these narrow leaves, these angustifolia, I guess. So yeah, it's got these big, long, narrow leaves. They're much thinner than they are long. And from a distance, you can actually use the leaves to kind of identify fireweed from a distance because they always tend to be in this curved shape. And that's what we're looking at in this little photo right here, if you can see my cursor. So the leaves start and then they point upwards and then they curve out. And so all the leaves they go all the way around the plant and they're in this arcing shape. And it's very distinctive looking when you see your fireweed out in the wild. But remember our hardhack as well, it had the serrated ends. Our fireweed, this is an example of a leaf that's entire or smooth all the way around. There you go. Alrighty, moving on to our next group, we have some heathers. Alrighty, so our heathers, these are plants that tend to grow in kind of cold conditions, subalpine conditions, really hardy little plants there. And so you'll notice with our heathers, compared to the other plants that we were looking at, they tend to have these really needly looking little leaves there. And first of all is our crowberry, Empetrum nigrum. So one way to remember this Latin name here, nigrum, kind of comes from the Latin word for black, which is nigrios. And the crowberry produces these little black berries. A crow is a black bird. And just a little tidbit for your own knowledge, this is a plant that's really widely dispersed. You find species of Empetrum in South America, and then Empetrum nigrum, this species, you find it's circumpolar, so you find it in the northern hemisphere in kind of polar regions all the way around the world. And it's thought that it was spread by migrating birds that carry these seeds all over the place. So crowberry, potentially spread by crows, and produces black little berries there. How easy is that to remember that Latin name? Alrighty, and here's a closer look at some of those black little berries. If we're going to be super technical and botanical, this actually isn't a berry. It's a type of fruit that we call a drupe. And a drupe is a thing like a cherry or a peach. It's got a little pit in the middle. So this is just think of this as being like a tiny little cherry. I don't think that these are especially good eating. You're going to want to double check that if you find these out in the wild. And these are what the flowers look like. So they're kind of these scary looking flowers, aren't they? Yeah, the flowers of the crowberry and Empetrum nigrum tend to be this really vivid kind of deep blood red color. And they look like these funny little alien things. They've got these petals that are fused together in sort of a disc shape. And they've got these really prominent looking stamens coming out, and yeah, there's really funny little things. Another thing about this plant, compared to some other heathers, it's got these really stumpy little needles here that are quite thick. So that is another thing to keep in mind when you're identifying your crowberry. But if you can find the flowers or find the berries, that's going to be the best thing to identify this plant. And another heather. So we've got our pink mountain heather now. This is beautiful. This is a really easy one to find if you're in the mountains around Vancouver. I took this photo from up above, kind of by Deeks Peak, which is in the Sea to Sky corridor there. And so the pink mountain heather is all this stuff in the middle here. This is a little conifer tree, and it has it has those needles, but you don't want to get that confused with your heather here, even though it kind of looks similar. They're both kind of needly looking. Alrighty, and coming into why it is called pink mountain heather is because it produces these gorgeous pink flowers. Really enjoy these kind of earlier in summer. And so notice that they're kind of this bell shape. That's opposed to the crowberry flowers that we looked at that were really kind of way more flattened looking. This bell shape for lots of heathers or lots of species that we call ericaceous, that it's a very typical kind of flower shape there. Ericaceous species, those are ones that are all in the heather family, and that actually includes a lot of plants like your blueberries and huckleberries and things like that as well. You can also look at the needles of this one, and you'll notice that these little needly looking leaves, they're a lot longer and more slender looking than the crowberry. So if you don't have your flowers around, that is one thing to look for. Look for the needles that are a lot more slender. And believe it or not, this is what the fruit of your pink mountain heather looks like. So there's kind of these dried up capsules here. Not too inspiring. You'll see these later on in the summer. Yeah, just kind of gross. Alrighty, now things that don't look like anything else are inconfusibles. First off, Partridgefoot, Luetkea pectinata. So funky little scientific name there. The way I remember this is that partridges are birds that like to peck things, so pectinata, there you go. This is another species that you find kind of higher up in the alpine, and this is actually a really small little plant here. So this little circle right here, this little disc of the leaves, that'll be only about the size of your thumb, or maybe a little bit bigger than that. So yeah, it's quite a small, delicate little plant. Really, yeah, it's really pretty when you find it out in the wild. Okay, so here is where the name Partridgefoot comes from. So let's take a look at these leaves over here. Now you notice the leaves have this really distinctive shape. And look how they come out, and then it looks like they've got these little toes here. Well, check out, this is a partridge in this photo over on the right, and check out the foot of this guy. So it comes out, and then it's got these 3 toes coming out there. So looks pretty similar. I had a point where I didn't really know how to identify this plant that well in the wild, but I knew there was a thing called partridgefoot, and then I was out hiking one day, and I saw it, and I saw these leaves, and I was like, there is nothing else that can be. These leaves, super distinctive, so great way to identify it. Okay, now a little bit of history. So you might wonder where the genus name Luetkea comes from. It's because it's named after this specimen right here. And this guy's name is Count Friedrich Luetkea. And he was this Russian explorer aristocrat guy he's kind of sailed up and down the Pacific coast way back in the day. And so another way you can think about this one, you don't remember the partridge feet, but check out this guy's big fuzzy round head. And check out the big fuzzy round shape of the plant. So there you go. Big fuzzy round things. It's kind of funny that they named it after him. So really enjoy that. All right, focusing in on the flowers now. Now remember from the first photo, the flowers occur on that red stalk in this big cluster, and just kind of these nondescript white flowers, lots of big long stamens kind of give it a fuzzy appearance, but really the best way to identify this one is by looking at those leaves. So that is what you're going to look for. Alrighty, next up, Pathfinder. Adenaucolon bicolor. So this is one, this isn't found in quite as marginal places as we see some of the others, but you know, a lot of those other plants that we're looking at, especially those tall pink flowers, your hardhack, your fireweed, those are found alongside roads. This is a really common plant to find around trails. And why is it called Pathfinder? It's because you look at the scientific name here, bicolor refers to the fact that this plant is really, really light colored on the bottom, almost white, and it's green on top. And so if you're walking through the forest, if you walk through a patch of this, you flick up all the leaves, and it's supposed to actually show you where you went. So that's a little trick if you're ever out and you think you're lost. Yeah, look for that Pathfinder. It could be a clue for where you went in the past. Alrighty, so this is an illustration of the bicolored leaves there. So you can see really, really white on the bottom, really kind of green on top. And that is the big distinguishing characteristic of this one. A few more features just to notice about the leaves. You know, they're kind of this general triangular shape, very distinctive looking sort of triangular shape. And then they're really wavy around the outside. Kind of looks a little bit like, you know, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that oak fern that we talked about in the last group. It was kind of wavy around the outside. This is sort of in the same vein as that. So triangular, wavy around the outside, and white on the bottom, really, really white. And the flowers. So this plant has some really cool flowers actually, and it falls in a family called the asters. And other examples of asters include dandelions, and they include sunflowers. And these things have these big, crazy looking compound flowers where it looks like one flower, but it's actually a cluster of dozens of flowers. And you'll have some flowers growing around the outside like this. They kind of look more petally, and then you have other flowers which fall in the middle. Yeah, and so that's called a head inflorescence that you find with the asters there. But just kind of these big clusters of white flowers is what you see with the Pathfinder. And they grow on these big crazy looking stalks too. So yeah, these will come up to, I think, kind of max out at about knee height. So that's just to give you a sense of scale for this plant. Alrighty, next up, common horsetail, Equisetum arvense. So it's a horse. In Latin, a horse is an equus, so Equisetum arvense, Bob's your uncle. You know, there's a few different kinds of horsetails here, but kind of in the lower mainland, southern British Columbia, this is the most common horsetail there. Yeah, this is an interesting plant because it produces two different types of stalks, a little bit like the deer fern that we were looking at earlier. On the left here, these ones are sterile, and so the purpose of this one is just to do all the photosynthesizing. And yeah, it's got this chlorophyll and kind of all these funny little branching structures, and then the leaves are technically these funny looking bands that go along the main stalk there. So it's kind of a really unique plant. On the right here, these are the fertile fronds, and so they produce these cone-like structures, these strobili on the ends of the stalks there, and you'll notice that they're really brown colors. They don't have the same chlorophyll as the sterile stalks there because these are really focused on just reproducing. These ones aren't really producing the energy for the plant. And then for some reason there's a photo of a brush in the middle here. Just looks like a toilet brush or a bottle brush, and that's kind of what this plant resembles in general. It's just generally this bottle brush shape. But remember, it's got the sterile fronds, it's got the fertile fronds. Equisetum arvense, your common horsetail. Yeah, this one, it's actually it's a pretty insidious weed in some places. You find this one growing in a lot in ditches. It really loves really damp places. I have some friends live in East Vancouver, and basically every summer their yard turns into a horsetail forest. It just grows up between the rocks all over the place. It's a really, really hardy plant, and its roots go extremely deep, and it's got these rhizomes that connect it as well, so it's really hard to get rid of. And believe it or not, from an evolutionary perspective, This is a really, really old plant as well. I think other than some of the mosses, this is probably the oldest from an evolutionary perspective plant that we're looking at in the course. You found these horsetails around kind of in dinosaur days as well. So really cool. Alrighty, and finally, we have our narrow-leaved cotton grass. I promised you another angustifolium, and here we are. This time, Eriophorum angustifolium. So, Eriophorum, I think forum is from Greek, and it refers to wool or fleece, or something that sheep have. So so that refers to the fact that that this plant produces all this really fluffy, cottony-looking product on its end there. And what these are attached to the seeds. And so the seeds will disperse on this cotton by wind. They'll go all over the place, and this kind of helps them do that. This is a plant that you find in really wet areas. You find it a lot in bogs. I've been doing lots of work in Burns Bog lately, in the lower mainlands, kind of out in the south of Vancouver. And this stuff is all over the place. And some places, BC and Canada in general are quite boggy places, especially when you get more into the boreal region up north. And so you can actually have, it looks, you get these big fields of narrow-leaved cotton grass like this. And it'll grow all over the place. There's this big field of fluff, really crazy looking. Alrighty, so this is to give a sense of proportion to it. So that cottony looking head on the end of the plant there, about 2 centimeters tall, you can see that. And then, this thing will get up to, when I've seen this thing, it's been a kind of knee height, thigh height, kind of that level. Alrighty, and one more thing about this plant is that this is a sedge. And so there's a few different types of what we call monocots. Those are these plants that are, they're really tall and they kind of grow in fields. They're the kind of things that you want to feed to horses. But there's a few different kinds. You got your sedges, your rushes, and your grasses. And if you're feeling really botanically inclined, then maybe you'll want to be able to distinguish between these someday. I know if you go into Forestry 200, then you'll certainly want to be able to do that. And so there's a little rhyme to distinguish between these different families. And it goes, sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses are hollow. What have you found? If you found some narrow-leaved cotton grass, then you have found a sedge, in spite of the name. All right, we will do the review in the live session, but thank you very much for attending to this video. Have a good one all.